Housewife's secret affair with neighbor ends in murder after 35-year marriage. True crime story. Imagine this. In a small, peaceful town where everyone knows everyone, a young man named Jordan Myers is found dead in a dark alley. Jordan was only 24, and he was well liked by the entire neighborhood. His sudden, mysterious death shocked everyone, leaving them heartbroken and searching for answers. But what if I told you this wasn't just a random tragedy? Hidden beneath this small town's quiet surface was a twisted, forbidden story that would turn everything upside down. It was a story the neighbors would never forget, a story filled with secrets, betrayal, and a relationship that should never have happened. At the center of it all were Violet and Carl Thompson. They had been married for 35 years, a long time to build trust, a family, and a shared life. People saw them as a stable, loving couple who had it all together. They were respected, well-liked, and often seen as role models in their quiet community of Lakeside Grove. But the truth? The truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Beneath Violet's friendly demeanor, she was hiding a secret, a dangerous obsession with someone who lived right next door. Now, what would make a woman in her late 50s, married for decades, risk everything she had for a young man who could be her son? What could drive someone to hide such dark secrets from everyone around them? And what was it about this young man, Jordan, that captivated her so completely, leading her down a path from which there was no turning back? Today, we're diving into a story of passion, betrayal, and love that never should have happened. We'll uncover how a friendly, seemingly harmless connection slowly twisted into an obsession, how one woman's desires grew darker, and how a husband's anger simmered into a quiet storm. All of this took place in a neighborhood where trust ran deep and where neighbors looked out for one another. But sometimes, even the closest relationships hide the deepest secrets. Our story takes place in Lakeside Grove, a quiet, close-knit town where people pride themselves on being a community. Neighbors wave at each other in passing, they share morning coffee chats and swap recipes. It's the kind of place where people think they know everything about each other, where life seems safe and predictable. For years, Violet and Carl Thompson were respected parts of this fabric. Violet was known for her warmth, her helpfulness, and her friendly smile, while Carl was seen as the steady, reliable husband. Together they seemed to have it all figured out. But everything changed the day Jordan Myers moved in next door. Jordan, a young man with a bright smile and a helping hand for anyone who needed it, was just settling into town, ready to make a fresh start. He saw Violet as a mentor and friend, someone he could trust. But for Violet, those feelings quickly turned into something more. What started as innocent gestures and friendly visits grew into a fixation she could no longer control. No one knew just how far her feelings had gone, but soon it became clear something wasn't right. Rumors began to spread. Neighbors noticed that Jordan was at Violet's house often, too often, and Carl, her husband, began to notice changes too. Violet seemed distracted, hiding her phone, disappearing at odd hours, and her once warm smile was replaced with a distant look. Today, we're revealing the hidden life Violet tried so hard to keep under wraps. The story of how a married woman became dangerously obsessed with the boy next door, how their dark connection unraveled, and how it all led to an ending no one could have predicted. To really understand how everything fell apart, we need to go back and look at who these people were and what led them to this moment. Violet and Carl Thompson had been together for over 3 decades. They met in their 20s, fell in love, and built a life together in the quiet town of Lakeside Grove. They had routines, shared memories, and a house filled with years of photos, gifts, and souvenirs from a long, shared journey. To their neighbors, they were a solid couple, never flashy, just steady. Carl was the reliable type. He was quiet, kept to himself, and didn't feel the need to make a big impression. He was a hard worker, the kind of man who woke up early, worked all day, and spent his weekends tending to the yard or fixing things around the house. He was practical and steady, the kind of person who didn't seek out excitement. And for a long time, Violet was fine with that. But as the years passed, Violet started to feel a sense of loneliness that grew slowly, almost like a shadow creeping into her life. She felt unseen, unappreciated, almost invisible in her own home. Carl loved her, of course, but somewhere along the way, he'd stopped noticing the little things about her. He didn't ask about her day, didn't notice if she'd gotten a new dress or changed her hair, and that emptiness started to grow. Then, one spring afternoon, the house next door got a new tenant. A young man named Jordan Myers moved in, bringing a fresh energy that caught everyone's attention. Jordan was 24, tall and full of life. He had a warm, friendly smile, and he wasn't shy about stopping to chat with anyone he met. He made friends easily, was always ready to lend a hand, and quickly became a part of the community. For Violet, Jordan represented something she hadn't felt in years: attention, admiration, a spark of something new and exciting. At first, it was nothing more than a neighborly friendship. Jordan would drop by to borrow a tool, ask for advice, or just say hello. Violet would bake him cookies, offer him tips for his garden, and share little stories from around the neighborhood. It was harmless, friendly, or so it seemed. But the truth is, Violet found herself looking forward to those visits in a way that felt different, a way that brought her back to her younger self. Jordan's warmth and attention made her feel special and seen, and slowly, what started as kindness turned into something else. Violet began to wait for him, hoping he'd stop by. She'd make excuses to go outside, just to catch a glimpse of him. And soon, she found herself crossing a line she never thought she'd cross. Jordan, on the other hand, saw Violet as a friendly, trustworthy neighbor, someone who reminded him of a mother figure. He was respectful and grateful for her kindness, never once thinking anything was out of the ordinary. To him, she was just his neighbor, someone to chat with over the fence or share a laugh with. But for Violet, it was more. She began to do small favors for him, offering to help with things that didn't need help, making herself available whenever he needed. It was subtle at first, and Jordan didn't see it. But to the neighbors, to the people who were watching from afar, something felt a little unusual. Jordan was often seen at her house. They seemed closer than just neighbors. It wasn't long before Carl noticed changes in his wife, too. She was distracted and quieter than usual. She'd take phone calls in the other room, started dressing up a bit more than usual, and spent longer hours in the garden, always keeping an eye on the fence. He tried to brush it off at first, chalking it up to her wanting a little more social interaction. But then he started seeing Jordan at their house more often, saw the way Violet's eyes lit up when he was around, and saw how her laughter sounded different, lighter, almost younger. Carl didn't want to believe it, but there was something there he couldn't ignore. Still, he kept his suspicions to himself, hoping it was all in his head. As months passed, Violet's feelings grew stronger. She began to write little notes for Jordan, messages disguised as friendly advice, but with undertones she thought he might notice. She'd cook extra dinners, hoping he'd join her, and she found reasons to linger by his side, her words soft, her gaze lingering a little too long. For Jordan, this attention was still just neighborly kindness, something he appreciated but never thought too deeply about. But for Violet, it was everything. She felt alive again, caught in a rush of emotions she hadn't felt in decades. Her mind wandered to thoughts she knew she shouldn't entertain, but she couldn't help herself. And Carl? He was watching from the sidelines, quietly piecing together what he was seeing, hoping it wasn't true, praying this wasn't what he feared. But each day, he saw his wife drifting further away from him, her attention always somewhere else, on someone else. It wasn't just Carl who noticed the odd behavior. The neighbors began to talk too. They saw Jordan at Violet's house more often than seemed normal. They noticed how Violet seemed to light up whenever he was around, how her gaze would follow him, and how she'd laugh a little too loud at his jokes. Rumors began to circulate, whispers in quiet corners, casting shadows on Violet's once respected name. But Violet was too caught up in her feelings to notice. For her, this new connection had become something she couldn't live without, something that filled a void she'd ignored for too long. It was like a flame she couldn't resist, even though she knew it would burn her. Today, were peeling back the layers of this twisted bond, uncovering the dark side of a love that never should have been, and exploring what happens when one person's obsession spirals out of control. What happens when a simple friendship crosses the line into something forbidden? For Violet, her feelings for Jordan had grown too intense to ignore. She told herself it was harmless, that he was just a friend, maybe even like family. But deep down, she knew her emotions had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. One summer evening after a long day, Jordan stopped by for a quick chat. It was casual, innocent, but this time there was something different in the air. Violet felt her heart race. The distance between them felt smaller, and the silence after their laughter felt heavier. She could feel her feelings getting out of control, but she didn't pull back. Instead, she leaned in, testing the boundary, waiting to see if he'd pull away. Jordan, perhaps a little caught off guard, didn't pull away either. That moment, a single, quiet moment, changed everything. It was the start of something that neither of them could have anticipated or stopped. After that night, everything felt different. Violet and Jordan both felt it. They began meeting more often, finding reasons to be alone. It started with small things, running into each other by accident, a lingering conversation on the porch, a quick chat turning into hours of talking. But soon, these small moments weren't enough. They began meeting in secret, away from the eyes of the town, away from Carl's quiet suspicions. At first, Jordan convinced himself that he was just being friendly, that he was only humoring his neighbor who seemed lonely and kind. But as time went on, he felt himself getting pulled in, wrapped up in something he didn't fully understand. He was young, and the thrill of secrecy was exciting, even if he knew it wasn't right. For Violet, however, it was more than excitement. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years, and each secret meeting only fueled her obsession. As the affair grew, Violet's behavior became more intense. She started sending Jordan messages late at night, things that seemed friendly but hinted at something more. She'd leave little notes for him, small gifts that she'd hide by his door, hoping he'd find them. She'd ask personal questions, wanting to know everything about him, his past, his dreams, his fears. The more she knew, the more she wanted. For Jordan, this attention was starting to feel overwhelming. What began as friendly visits had turned into a relationship that felt like a weight on his shoulders. He tried to create some distance, to pull back a little, but Violet wasn't having it. Each time he tried to slow things down, she only became more desperate, more clingy. Meanwhile, Carl was quietly watching, piecing things together in his own mind. He noticed the strange hours, the way Violet's phone would light up with messages at odd times. He saw how she seemed to light up whenever Jordan's name came up, how she'd find reasons to bring him up in conversation. Carl had always been calm and practical, but even he couldn't ignore the changes in his wife. One evening, Carl came home early from work, hoping to surprise Violet. As he walked up to the house, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. Through the window, he saw Violet and Jordan talking, standing a little too close, their voices low and their body language far too familiar. Carl felt his heart sink. He didn't confront them then, but he knew. He knew that something was wrong, something he could no longer ignore. For Violet, each moment with Jordan felt like a new chapter in her life, something thrilling and forbidden. Eventually, what had been stolen glances and quiet meetings crossed another line. One night, when Jordan came by, Violet made a move she hadn't dared before. She reached out, brushing his hand, lingering just long enough for him to understand. Jordan, confused and caught up in the moment, didn't resist. And that was it. They had crossed a line they could never come back from. The affair was no longer just emotional. It had become physical, deepening the connection between them and sealing the secret they both now shared. But while Violet's passion only grew, Jordan was starting to feel trapped. What had started as a thrill was now becoming a weight he couldn't shake. He felt like he was losing control, like Violet was always watching, always waiting for him. It was too much, and he knew he had to find a way out. Jordan began pulling away, trying to distance himself from Violet. He'd make excuses, say he was busy, avoid her messages. He thought it would be simple, that she'd let go and move on. But Violet couldn't let go. She became desperate, watching his every move, sending more messages, showing up unexpectedly, hoping to catch him alone. The more he pulled away, the more she clung on. She'd leave notes on his car, text him at all hours, and even started following him to places he went. Jordan felt like he was being suffocated, like there was no escape. He even confided in a close friend, telling him about this strange, oppressive relationship he'd found himself in. His friend urged him to end it, to make a clean break before things got worse. But ending it wouldn't be easy. Violet's obsession was too strong, her desire too intense. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him, of going back to a life without that excitement, without the thrill that had brought her back to life. She felt like she'd invested too much, given too much of herself, and she wasn't ready to let go. While Violet and Jordan were caught in this storm of emotions, Carl was quietly simmering with anger. He knew about the affair but chose not to confront it outright. Instead, he observed in silence, watching as his wife drifted further and further away, his suspicions confirmed with every late-night message, every whispered conversation, every shared glance. But instead of erupting in anger, Carl's rage turned inward. He withdrew from Violet, no longer trying to win her attention or affection. He didn't ask questions, didn't confront her. Instead, he let his anger grow, let it fester inside him, waiting for the right moment. His silence was deliberate, and it was chilling. He knew that one day the truth would come out, and he would be ready. In a small town like Lakeside Grove, secrets don't stay hidden for long. The neighbors had begun to notice that something was amiss. They saw the way Violet and Jordan interacted, the way she seemed too attached, too eager whenever he was around. They'd see her car parked outside his place or watch as he'd sneak out of her house late in the evening. Rumors started to spread, whispers that grew louder with each passing week. Friends and neighbors began to wonder if there was more to this friendship than met the eye. Violet had once been respected and well-liked, but now, people started looking at her differently. The sense of judgment, the unspoken accusations, she could feel them all, but she didn't care. All she cared about was Jordan, and she was willing to sacrifice everything to keep him close. What Violet didn't realize was how dangerous her obsession had become, not only for her, but for Jordan as well. She was too caught up in her emotions to see the damage she was causing, the lives she was tearing apart. And Jordan? He was trapped, caught in the middle of a relationship he no longer wanted but couldn't escape. And then there was Carl, silent, patient, his anger simmering beneath the surface, waiting. As the affair grew more intense, it was only a matter of time before everything would explode in a way that no one could have predicted. With each passing day, Violet's attachment to Jordan grew deeper. Her thoughts were consumed by him, and the boundaries she had crossed seemed less and less important. But as their secret relationship continued, the weight of it all began to press down on her. She knew she was risking everything, her marriage, her reputation, her life as she knew it, but she couldn't let go. Jordan, however, was feeling something entirely different. What had once been thrilling was now a burden. He felt trapped in a cycle he couldn't break free from, worried about what might happen if anyone found out. He knew it had to end, but each time he tried to pull away, Violet would find a way to reel him back in. In a small town like Lakeside Grove, it's hard to keep secrets. The neighbors had been whispering for a while, casting sidelong glances whenever they saw Violet and Jordan together. People noticed how often he was at her house, and how Violet seemed to light up around him in a way that was hard to ignore. There was an undeniable tension between them, something more than just neighborly kindness, and everyone could see it. Whispers turned into rumors, and rumors turned into hushed conversations. Friends and neighbors were quick to talk behind Violet's back, speculating on what was really going on. Was she having an affair? Had Carl found out? And why was Jordan, a young man with his whole life ahead of him, tangled up in such a messy situation? Carl, meanwhile, was quietly absorbing it all. He heard the rumors and felt the change in the way people looked at him, but he didn't react. He stayed calm, never once confronting Violet or Jordan directly. He didn't have to. Deep down, he knew what was happening. His suspicions had long been confirmed by the little things, the secretive glances, the lingering conversations, the late-night messages that lit up Violet's phone. But rather than confronting his wife, Carl chose a different path. He pulled away, his emotions simmering under the surface, letting his anger build slowly, quietly. Every time he saw Jordan with Violet, every whispered rumor he overheard, every lingering look they exchanged, his anger grew. But he kept it all inside, refusing to show his hand, refusing to let them know just how much he knew. For Jordan, the pressure was almost unbearable. He felt like he was living in a bubble, always on edge, always worried someone might find out. What started as a thrill had turned into a nightmare. Violet's affection had gone from flattering to suffocating, her messages more intense, her requests more demanding, and the rumors didn't help. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, the suspicion, the judgment. One evening, after yet another intense conversation with Violet, he confided in a friend. He shared his concerns and his growing fear of what he'd gotten himself into. His friend warned him, told him to be careful, to end things as quickly as he could. But even as he said it, Jordan knew that ending it wouldn't be easy. He'd seen the way Violet looked at him, the desperation in her eyes. He knew she wouldn't let go without a fight. Violet, meanwhile, was losing control. Her obsession with Jordan had taken over every part of her life. She'd lie awake at night, thinking about him, wondering what he was doing, wishing he were by her side. She knew the town was talking, that people were judging her, but she didn't care. All she cared about was Jordan. As he began to pull away, Violet became even more desperate. She'd send him long messages, pleading with him to see her, to talk to her, to give her just a little more time. She'd follow him, showing up at places she knew he'd be, hoping to catch his attention, hoping to remind him of the connection they shared. But her desperation only pushed Jordan further away. Each message, each unannounced visit, each pleading look only made him feel more trapped, more suffocated. He knew he had to break free, but he didn't know how. As the tension continued to build, Carl reached his breaking point. He'd spent months watching from the sidelines, letting his anger fester, refusing to confront either of them directly. But his patience was wearing thin. He'd sacrificed too much, given too much of himself to be treated this way, and he knew he couldn't stay silent forever. But Carl was smart. He didn't want a messy confrontation. He wanted something more. Calculated. He began to pull away even more, spending less time at home, coming and going without a word, leaving Violet to wonder if he knew. He was planning something, waiting for the right moment to take action. He wanted her to feel the weight of her choices, to know that he was watching, that he wouldn't let her get away with what she'd done. As the rumors reached a boiling point, the town of Lakeside Grove was in turmoil. People were choosing sides, some defending Violet, others feeling sorry for Carl, and still others casting judgment on Jordan. The once quiet neighborhood was now filled with tension, each person feeling the impact of Violet and Jordan's choices in one way or another. Friends who once welcomed Violet with open arms now hesitated to speak to her. The warm greetings she once received turned to cold stares and whispered judgments. Even Carl, who had once been respected for his calm demeanor, found himself the subject of pity and gossip. It was as if the entire town was caught up in the web of Violet's choices, each person a spectator in this unfolding drama. In a last attempt to escape the situation, Jordan decided he had to leave. He couldn't keep living this way, couldn't keep hiding from everyone, feeling the weight of Violet's obsession pressing down on him. He wanted his life back, his freedom, his sense of normalcy. But as he prepared to leave, to cut all ties and start fresh, Violet confronted him. She begged him to stay, pleaded with him to give her one more chance, to not abandon her. She painted a picture of a life they could have together, a fantasy she'd built up in her mind. But for Jordan, it was too late. He told her he couldn't do it, that he needed to be free. He didn't realize just how much that rejection would hurt her, how deep her obsession truly ran. Violet's heart was shattered. She couldn't bear the thought of losing Jordan, of returning to the life she'd tried so hard to escape. Her desperation reached a fever pitch, her obsession turning darker, more dangerous. She began to see Jordan's rejection as a betrayal, something she couldn't forgive. In her mind, she'd given everything for him, risked everything, and he was just leaving. Carl, on the other hand, saw this as his moment. He'd waited and watched. And now, with tensions at an all-time high, he was ready to act. He could feel the storm coming, and he was prepared. He knew Violet and Jordan would meet one last time, that she'd try to convince him to stay. And he planned to be there, waiting, ready to take his revenge. By now, the entire community was bracing for what felt like the inevitable. People felt the tension in the air, the sense that something was coming, something that would shake the town to its core. Friends, neighbors, and even family members could feel the weight of the secret, the darkness that had settled over Lakeside Grove. But no one could have guessed how it would end, just how far Violet's obsession and Carl's anger would go, or the tragedy that would leave a permanent scar on their quiet town. Violet's obsession, Carl's silent rage, and Jordan's desperation had reached a boiling point. It was only a matter of time before everything would come crashing down, leaving no one untouched. The stage was set for a final confrontation, a moment where secrets would be revealed, and the lives of everyone involved would be changed forever. What would happen next? Would Violet's obsession drive her to do something unthinkable? Would Carl finally unleash the anger he'd been holding back? And would Jordan ever find a way out of the nightmare that had taken over his life? Stay with us as we uncover the devastating final chapter in this tragic story. Carl had spent months in silent agony, watching his wife slip away and become someone he no longer recognized. He saw the changes in her, the late nights, the hushed phone calls, the secret glances with Jordan. Every moment they shared felt like a dagger to his heart, a reminder of the betrayal that he was too proud to confront outright. But Carl wasn't the type to explode in anger. No, he was too controlled for that. Instead, he buried his pain deep down, letting it simmer into something far more dangerous. While Violet and Jordan were wrapped up in their secret affair, Carl was planning his next move, waiting for the perfect moment to take his revenge. Carl's approach was subtle at first. He started to withdraw from Violet entirely, giving her the space she seemed to crave. He came home later than usual, left earlier in the morning, and stopped showing any interest in her comings and goings. At first, Violet barely noticed, too distracted by her obsession with Jordan. But over time, she began to sense the shift. Carl was cold and distant, almost as if he wasn't really there, and that distance made her uneasy. This wasn't the Carl she had married, the calm and reliable man she thought she could always count on. This new version of Carl was unpredictable, and for the first time Violet began to feel a hint of fear. She didn't know what he was thinking, didn't know how much he knew, and that scared her. Carl knew he couldn't let his emotions get the best of him. He had to be smart, strategic, and careful. He watched Violet and Jordan closely, taking note of every detail, every secret message, every little clue they left behind. He kept his emotions locked away, staying focused on his plan, determined to make them both pay for what they'd done. He began gathering evidence, things he could use later if he needed to. He saved messages he'd seen on Violet's phone, kept track of the times Jordan visited, and made mental notes of every suspicious detail. He wanted to be ready for whatever came next, to have everything he needed when the time was right. Then one evening, Carl came home unexpectedly and found Violet and Jordan in a close, intimate moment. They weren't doing anything obvious, but the way they looked at each other, the closeness between them, it was all Carl needed to see. He felt a cold rage rise within him, a fury so deep it took everything he had not to act on it right then and there. But instead of confronting them, Carl simply walked away, choosing not to give them the satisfaction of knowing he'd seen them. He knew that any outburst would only give them more power and make them feel like they'd won. So he kept quiet, letting the anger grow inside him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Carl's silence became his weapon. He knew Violet and Jordan would eventually slip up, that their secret couldn't stay hidden forever. So he began setting things up, creating a plan that would force them both to face the consequences of their actions. He decided to turn their own secrecy against them, to make sure they could no longer keep up the lie.
One night, he left subtle clues around the house that hinted he knew about the affair. A misplaced phone, a slightly open text message, a comment that seemed innocent but was loaded with meaning. He wanted Violet to feel the pressure, to know he was watching. And it worked. Violet became nervous and jumpy, always looking over her shoulder, wondering if Carl had finally figured it out. Violet started to feel like her world was closing in on her. Carl's coldness was unnerving, and she began to feel the weight of her own guilt pressing down on her. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to admit it. She felt trapped, torn between her obsession with Jordan and her fear of what Carl might do if he found out the truth. The late-night messages, the secret meetings, they all began to feel risky, dangerous. But even though she knew she should stop, she couldn't. She was too deep, too wrapped up in her feelings to let go. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The more Carl watched, the more his anger grew. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and worst of all, powerless. He had given his life to this marriage, and poured everything into his home, his family, and his relationship with Violet, only to be tossed aside for a younger man. The bitterness was consuming him, and he knew he couldn't let it go on any longer. But Carl wanted something more than just revenge. He wanted Violet to understand the pain she had caused, to feel the weight of her betrayal, to see how her actions had torn him apart. And he knew exactly how to make that happen. One evening, Carl overheard Violet making plans to meet Jordan at a secluded park, a place they thought was safe, hidden away from prying eyes. Carl saw his opportunity, the chance he had been waiting for. He didn't confront her. Instead, he simply listened, keeping his anger in check, waiting for the right moment to act. When the night came, Carl made his way to the park, arriving before they did. He hid in the shadows, watching, waiting. He could feel his heart pounding, his anger pulsing through him like a steady drumbeat. He was ready to confront them, to finally make them face the consequences of their actions. When Violet and Jordan arrived, they thought they were alone. They began to talk, their voices low, their movements cautious. But before they could go any further, Carl stepped out of the shadows, his presence startling them both. The look on his face was one of cold, calculated fury, a lifetime of betrayal and hurt all wrapped up in that single moment. The air was thick with tension, the silence heavy and unbearable. Violet tried to explain, to stammer out an excuse, but Carl didn't want to hear it. He was done with excuses, done with lies. He wanted them to know exactly how much pain they had caused, to feel the weight of their actions bearing down on them. In a voice that was calm but deadly, Carl told them he knew everything. He laid it all out, each detail, every secret he had uncovered. He let them feel the sting of their own choices, the shame of being caught in their lies. And for the first time, Violet realized just how much she had hurt him, just how deeply she had betrayed the man she had once promised to love. But Carl didn't stop there. He demanded that they face what they had done, that they confront the damage they had caused. He wanted them to feel every ounce of his pain, to see the scars their betrayal had left behind. But as the argument escalated, the tension between them grew unbearable. Words turned into accusations turned into anger, and in a fit of rage, Carl lashed out. In that single, tragic moment, the years of betrayal, pain, and silence came crashing down in an explosion of violence. Violet, caught between her love for Jordan and the guilt over her actions, was helpless to stop it. What began as a simple confrontation spiraled into something no one could control, leaving all three of them forever changed. Carl's desire for revenge had consumed him, leading him down a path he could never return from. In the end, Carl's silent revenge turned into a tragedy that no one could have predicted. The town of Lakeside Grove would never be the same, haunted by the memory of that night, by the lives that were forever shattered by secrets, lies, and betrayal. This was the moment that would define them all, the point of no return that none of them could escape. When news broke of what happened that night at the secluded park, the entire town of Lakeside Grove was shaken. Rumors spread like wildfire, and the community was left in disbelief. They couldn't wrap their minds around how three people from their neighborhood, people they thought they knew so well, could be involved in something so dark, so tragic. Friends, neighbors, and even family members were stunned. They remembered Carl as a steady, reliable man, Violet as a friendly, helpful neighbor, and Jordan as the kind, young man who'd always lend a hand. The truth of what had happened, of how obsession and betrayal had led to violence, was almost too much to bear. Within hours of the incident, the police launched a full investigation. They combed through evidence, piecing together what had led up to that terrible night. Detectives interviewed neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have seen something suspicious. They gathered phone records, texts, and voicemails, slowly uncovering the truth behind Violet and Jordan's relationship. It didn't take long for the police to discover the secret messages, the late-night texts, and the whispers shared between Violet and Jordan. They found the love notes Violet had sent, the times they'd met in secret, and the places they thought were hidden. Each new discovery revealed the layers of secrecy and the weight of Violet's obsession. When the detectives brought Violet in for questioning, she tried to hold back, to keep up the story she'd been telling herself. She wanted to paint her relationship with Jordan as innocent, to make it seem like a friendship that had been misunderstood. But under the weight of the evidence and the detectives' questions, her mask began to slip. Eventually, Violet broke down. She confessed to everything: the secret relationship, her feelings for Jordan, and the desperate steps she'd taken to keep him close. She admitted that her feelings had crossed a line, that what had started as a simple friendship had become an obsession she couldn't control. In her confession, she described how she felt alive with Jordan, how he had filled a void in her life that she hadn't known was there. But she also admitted that her feelings had gone too far, that she had lost control. Carl, on the other hand, was calm and almost emotionless when questioned. He didn't try to hide his anger or his actions. He simply told the truth, describing the months he'd spent in silence, watching his wife slip away, feeling the weight of betrayal settle in his heart. He admitted to planning his confrontation with Violet and Jordan, to letting his anger grow until he couldn't hold it in any longer. For Carl, it wasn't about making excuses or finding sympathy. He knew what he had done and was willing to accept the consequences. He didn't try to shift blame or plead innocence. Instead, he told the detectives everything, almost as if confessing was a way to finally let go of the pain he had been carrying. With Violet and Carl's confessions, the police had everything they needed to build a case. But it wasn't just the words that painted the picture of what had happened. They had messages, voicemails, and testimonies from friends who had seen the changes in Violet, who had noticed her obsession and Carl's growing distance. They had witness accounts from neighbors who had seen Jordan visiting Violet late at night, who had watched the once friendly exchanges turn into something darker. Every piece of evidence pointed to a story of betrayal, obsession, and revenge. It was a tragic tale, one that the town would never forget. The trial that followed was like something out of a movie. People from all over the community filled the courtroom, wanting to understand how this could have happened. They wanted answers, explanations, something that could make sense of the horror that had unfolded in their quiet town. Violet took the stand, tearful and remorseful, describing her feelings for Jordan and the spiral that had taken over her life. She admitted to her obsession, to the lengths she had gone to keep him close, to the way she had lost herself in a fantasy that had no place in reality. Her confession was raw, a painful reminder of how far she had fallen. Carl's testimony was different. He spoke calmly, without emotion, detailing how he had felt betrayed, how he had watched his marriage crumble before his eyes. He described the anger he had carried, the way it had built up inside him until he felt there was no other choice. He didn't ask for sympathy, he only wanted the truth to be known. In the end, the court found both Violet and Carl guilty. Carl, for his role in the tragic ending that night at the park, received a life sentence. His silence, his calculated revenge, had left no room for leniency. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, paying for the choices he had made, choices he couldn't take back. Violet, on the other hand, received a lighter sentence. The court recognized her remorse, her confession, and the depth of her obsession that had clouded her judgment. She was sentenced to 20 years, a punishment that reflected the damage her choices had caused. She would have years to think about what she had done, to face the reality of her actions and the lives she had destroyed. As the sentences were handed down, the town of Lakeside Grove was left to pick up the pieces. The loss of Jordan, a young man with so much life ahead of him, was a wound that would never fully heal. Friends, family, and neighbors mourned his loss, trying to understand how something like this could have happened right in their backyard. Violet and Carl's actions had left a permanent scar on the community, a reminder of the darkness that can hide behind closed doors, of the secrets that can tear apart even the most peaceful of neighborhoods. Years after the trial, the story of Violet, Carl, and Jordan would become something of a legend in Lakeside Grove. People would tell it as a warning, a reminder of what happens when desire turns to obsession, when anger is left to fester in silence. It was a story of love gone wrong, of choices that could never be undone, and of lives forever changed by secrets. Violet, sitting in her prison cell, would have years to reflect on the choices she had made and the lives she had affected. She would carry the weight of her actions with her, the memories of Jordan and Carl haunting her like shadows from a life she could never reclaim. As for Carl, he would live out his days behind bars, a quiet man who had once been steady and reliable, now marked by a single act of violence that had changed everything. The town would never be the same. The once idyllic streets of Lakeside Grove now held a darker history, a story that had become part of the fabric of the community. It was a story people would remember, a tale that would be passed down, a reminder of the hidden truths that lie beneath the surface. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. People from all over Lakeside Grove, who had known Violet, Carl, and Jordan as neighbors and friends, now gathered to watch the painful story come to its final chapter. No one could believe that this tale of love, betrayal, and violence had happened right in their own town. The atmosphere was tense, filled with a mix of grief, shock, and curiosity. People who had once trusted and respected Violet and Carl were now filled with questions. How could this have happened? How could two people who had seemed so ordinary, so rooted in the community, have let things go this far? When it was Violet's turn to testify, the room fell silent. She walked to the stand slowly, her face showing the weight of everything that had happened. Her once warm smile was gone, replaced by a look of regret and sadness. She knew that everyone in that room was judging her, that every eye was on her, waiting to hear what she had to say. With trembling hands, Violet began to tell her story. She admitted to everything, the obsession, the secrecy, the lengths she'd gone to keep Jordan in her life. She described how her feelings had spiraled out of control, how the loneliness and the desire for something new had driven her to do things she could never take back. Her voice broke as she spoke about Jordan, about the connection she thought they'd had, about how she had seen him as a source of happiness she hadn't felt in years. She tried to explain that she hadn't meant for things to go this far, that she had never imagined it would end in tragedy. But the truth was, she knew her obsession had turned dangerous, that her actions had led to this heartbreaking end. Carl's testimony was different. He didn't show the same regret as Violet. Instead, he spoke with a calmness that made the room uneasy. He described how he had felt betrayed, how he had watched his wife drift away, and how he had stayed silent as his anger grew. He explained how he had planned his revenge, how he had waited for the perfect moment to confront them both. He spoke about the pain he had carried, the feeling of losing everything he had worked so hard to build. For Carl, it wasn't about defending himself. It was about making sure the truth was known, and that everyone understood what had driven him to that final, tragic moment. Carl didn't beg for forgiveness. He didn't ask for sympathy. He accepted what he had done and the consequences that would follow. But the calmness with which he spoke left the courtroom in a strange silence, as if people were holding their breath, unable to fully process the depth of his pain and anger. After days of testimony, the jury was sent to deliberate. It felt like an eternity as everyone waited, the weight of the entire case pressing down on them. Friends, family, and neighbors sat together, sharing quiet whispers, wondering what kind of verdict would bring justice to such a complicated, heartbreaking situation. When the jury finally returned, the tension was almost unbearable. The four-person stood, delivering the verdict with a voice that seemed to echo through the entire room. The court found both Violet and Carl guilty. Carl received a life sentence for his actions, his plan for revenge. His willingness to let his anger drive him to violence left no room for mercy. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, paying for the pain he had caused, for the tragic end to what had once been a quiet, ordinary life. Violet, however, was given a lighter sentence. The court took into account her confession, her genuine remorse, and the mental spiral that had consumed her life. She received 20 years, a punishment that reflected her role in the events but allowed her a chance at redemption someday, a chance to come to terms with what she had done. As the sentences were read, the people of Lakeside Grove were left to process what had just happened. Many felt that justice had been served and that Carl and Violet were paying for the choices they had made. But there was also a lingering sadness, a feeling that something precious had been lost forever. Jordan's friends and family sat in silence, grieving the young man who had been taken from them too soon. They mourned his kindness, his warmth, and the life he would never get to live. The town had lost one of its brightest, a loss that no sentence could ever truly make right. After the verdict was read, Violet broke down in tears. The weight of her actions, the reality of what had happened, finally hit her in full. She had destroyed her marriage, her life, and the life of a young man she had once seen as her closest friend. At that moment, she felt the full force of her guilt, the pain of everything she had lost, and the lives she had shattered. Violet knew that she would have years to think about what she had done, to relive every moment of her choices, every step that had led her to that terrible night. She would spend the rest of her days trying to understand how her life had spiraled so far out of control, and whether she could ever find peace. As Carl was led out of the courtroom, he looked around at the faces of the people he had known for years. He didn't speak, didn't try to explain himself. In his mind, there was nothing left to say. His silence was his final statement, a quiet acceptance of the choices he had made and the consequences he would face. Carl would spend the rest of his life behind bars. A man once known for his calmness and strength is now remembered only for the anger that had consumed him. He had let that anger drive him, let it cloud his judgment, and in the end, it had destroyed everything he had once held dear. As the court proceedings came to an end, the town of Lakeside Grove was left to pick up the pieces. People who had once trusted Violet and Carl now struggled to understand what had happened. Friends who had shared coffee and conversations with them now felt a sense of betrayal, a loss of innocence that would never truly heal. Jordan's family was left with memories of a young man who had been kind, helpful, and full of life. They would mourn him for years to come, wondering what his life could have been, what he might have accomplished. The pain of his loss was a wound that would never fully heal, a reminder of the choices that had led to such a tragic end. The story of Violet, Carl, and Jordan would become part of Lakeside Grove's history, a dark chapter in an otherwise peaceful town. It was a tale people would remember, a warning about the dangers of hidden desires, of the destructive power of jealousy and obsession. For years, people would speak in hushed tones about the affair, the betrayal, and the anger that had turned into violence. It was a story they would share as a lesson, a reminder of how even the smallest secrets can grow into something dangerous, something no one could have predicted. As time passed, the tragic story of Violet, Carl, and Jordan faded from the front pages, but it never left the minds of the people in Lakeside Grove. It became a story that everyone knew, a tragedy that stayed with them, a reminder of how quickly life can unravel. The neighborhood itself seemed changed. Friends who once gathered easily found it harder to trust, harder to believe that they truly knew each other. The quiet, friendly spirit of Lakeside Grove was replaced with a sense of caution, a reminder that even the most familiar faces can hide dark secrets. For Jordan's family and friends, life would never be the same. They remembered him as a young man with so much life and kindness, a person who was always ready to help anyone in need. He had a bright future ahead, dreams he would never get to fulfill, and a life that was taken far too soon. Jordan's friends would gather in his memory, sharing stories about the way he'd made them laugh, the times he'd been there for them. They'd remember his warmth, his smile, and the gentle way he moved through life. But they'd also remember the pain of losing him, the shock of finding out about the secret life he'd been drawn into. His memory would live on, a reminder of how quickly things can change, of how easily innocence can be lost. As Violet served her sentence, she would spend years reflecting on the choices that had led her to this point. She would have endless hours to replay every moment, every step she had taken down the path of obsession. She would look back on the way her feelings had spiraled, the way she had let her loneliness drive her to places she never thought she'd go. The guilt weighed heavily on her. She knew she had destroyed lives, including her own. She thought about the life she had with Carl, the home they had built, the years they had spent together. She wondered if things could have been different if she had just spoken up about her feelings instead of hiding them. But now, it was too late. The damage was done, and all she could do was live with the consequences. For Carl, the sentence of life in prison became his reality, a fate he had brought upon himself. He was left with nothing but time to think, time to remember, time to regret. His silence, once a symbol of his control, had become his prison, a reminder of the rage he had let consume him. He had acted on anger, had let his pain drive him to a place he couldn't come back from. And now, he was left to face the quiet emptiness of a life forever changed. Carl would never return to the home he had once shared with Violet, and never see the town of Lakeside Grove again. In his final moments of freedom, he had let anger rule, and it had cost him everything. For the people of Lakeside Grove, The story of Violet, Carl, and Jordan became a lesson, a reminder of the hidden sides of life, of the secrets people keep, and the danger of letting emotions go unspoken. It was a tragedy that showed how quickly love can turn to obsession, how easily anger can turn to violence, and how trust can be shattered in an instant. The once close community had been rocked by the events, and though life moved on, the memory of that tragic night lingered. People were more guarded, more aware of the cracks that can form in relationships, and the hidden pain that people carry. It was a story that everyone in town would remember, a dark reminder of how quickly things can fall apart. In the end, this story was one of choices. Violet chose to let her feelings take over, to ignore the line she was crossing. Carl chose to stay silent, to let his anger grow until it became too much to bear. And Jordan, caught in the middle, had made choices too, choices he would never have the chance to learn from. Each decision, each secret, each hidden emotion had led them to that fateful night in the park, to a place where no one could turn back. It was a chain of events, each link forged by choices that seemed small at first but had grown into something dangerous. As we leave the story of Violet, Carl, and Jordan, we're left with a powerful reminder of the impact of unspoken feelings and hidden lives. Sometimes, the things we don't say, the emotions we keep buried, can become our undoing. And in this case, those hidden truths led to a loss that could never be undone. This was a story of obsession, betrayal, and the quiet danger of letting emotions take control. A story that reminds us of the importance of honesty, of facing our fears, and of speaking the truths that lie in our hearts before it's too late. In the quiet streets of Lakeside Grove, life slowly returned to normal. But for those who had witnessed the tragedy, who had felt the impact of that night, things would never truly be the same. They would carry this story with them, a part of their history, a shadow that would always remind them of their lives forever changed. The end